My name is Phillips, and I'm currently working as the School of Graduate Studies Program Specialist, but I also do some work for the Women and Gender Studies Department, and that is how I got involved with this project. The event came about through information that was gathered through my own research project. I did a Master of Arts in Women and Gender Studies, and through my research, which focused on adolescent girls and women-specific senior secondary curricula, so basically girls who had access to a women's studies class in high school. I spoke with many girls in a case study of a school and learned that the course, Women's Studies, had a huge impact on their confidence. It helped them develop solidarity amongst each other and beyond their school walls as well. And they just came out with a sense of empowerment and really feeling good about themselves and what they could accomplish in life. So we wanted to take that information and move it forward and see if we could expand it, because such programs are very rare in Western Canada at this time.
Multigenerational Roundtable today. It's an event sponsored by Women and Gender Studies and with the assistance of the Gender Diversity and Equity Caucus from the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association. And first off, I'd like to say that Women and Gender Studies and all our faculty and all our students respectfully acknowledge that the University of Lethbridge resides on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot people, and we thank them for inviting us to share their land and territory. We have a great event today, and I hope you'll all get lively and converse. The first person I'd like to introduce is our event coordinator, Auburn Phillips, who is a recent graduate of a master's degree in Women and Gender Studies and Education, and her thesis is titled Perceptions of Women-Specific Senior Secondary Curricula in Western Canada. Auburn Phillips.
I didn't expect my thesis to be named and everything, but actually the thesis is kind of what inspired this event. I did research in Western Canada that offered a women's studies program to the high school students. This is really rare. Of the 1,300, more than 1,300 high schools in Western Canada, only 5 offer women's studies. And my research found that girls who had taken the class when they were 16 or 17 years old greatly benefited, had increased confidence, were able to deal with adversity much better, and perhaps most importantly felt a real sense of solidarity amongst themselves and towards other women that they began to encounter in their lives, instead of the more typical attitude of competition that you might see in a high school environment. As far as this event itself, I'd like to explore that because my research results were so positive, and I think, well, why is it only 5 schools then out of 1,300? So that's kind of the impetus of this event. How we got it going, we circulated some questions that are also on the backboard, and everyone's welcome to add their comments to that board as well. But you can see some responses that were already provided that we printed out on this side of the board. So what people thought about these questions, and we also really want to know what everyone else here thinks about those questions, and really want to make sure everyone knows how much we appreciate that you came today.
Now I'd like to introduce Catherine Kingfisher, who's a professor of anthropology at the University of Lethbridge. Her research focuses on policy, governance, personhood, neoliberalism, and globalism, and she's just completed an ethnographic monograph on policy travels across and within jurisdictions of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Alberta, Canada. And then also we have Suzanne Lennon, who I'm introducing now because Suzanne is our discussant, and she'll be here throughout the event listening, and her job is a big one. She's going to try and pull all the threads together at the end. She is assistant professor Department of Women and Gender Studies here at the University of Lethbridge, a wonderful colleague. Her research and teaching interests focus on critical race feminisms, law, gender and sexuality, and politics of nationalism, multiculturalism, and queer rights. So without further ado, I'll hand the panel over to Kathleen Kingfisher.
I just want to tell you a little bit about how we're going to proceed. We're going to start with an icebreaker first, just to get the conversation going, get people comfortable with having a conversation. And then we're going to have a total of 7 speakers, broken up into two segments, and in between we'll have time for conversation between you and the speakers, and then time for conversation amongst yourselves. And I think either before or after the breaks we'll have some draws for the book prizes. So we're going to start with the icebreaker, and the icebreaker is going to be conducted by Dr. Carly Adams, Associate Professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education. Her research interests include 20th century Canadian sport, gender, regional and local history, oral history, and women's sport governance. Dr. Adams is also the current chair of our Faculty Association's Gender Equity Diversity Caucus. So, Carly, thank you.
Welcome, everyone. What I'd like to do for the first sort of 10 minutes or so is to get us talking, because that's what this is all about, is to have those conversations and dialogue. And so what I want to do, I want all of you to think about your table here that you're sitting at. You'll notice that there are these nice whiteboards. They're big Post-it notes, actually, and this is what we're going to use for this activity. And there should be one at each table. So to start, there are a number of things I want you to do with this exercise. But to start, if you don't know the people sitting around you, please take a couple of moments and introduce yourselves. Not yet. Wait for a minute. So introduce yourselves. Second, I want you to reflect on what is feminism. What does the term feminism mean to you? What do you think of in terms of behaviors or experiences or personal actions or societal issues related to feminism? Okay, so I want you to take a few minutes to reflect on that. And then at your tables, I want you to designate someone as the person who's going to write it down. And then I want everyone to throw out their ideas. And we're going to create a list on your piece of paper there. Just start throwing out ideas, anything that comes to the top of your mind. And then after we're done, we'll take those Post-it sheets and we're going to put them up around the room. With the idea being that when we have our breaks, we're able to wander around the room and see what kinds of ideas everyone came up with. Okay? Now you can
And yes, indeed, women's lives have changed. We have seen women reach monumental roles at the UN, as prime ministers, as leaders of major corporations, and yes, as premiers in our provinces. We have come a long way. We have in the last 10, 15 years or so seen legislation that recognized family violence as a crime. In 1984, we saw the criminal code include sexual assault within marriage or common law relationships as a criminal offense as well. This certainly demonstrates some acts of acknowledgement to address long-standing and devastating impacts of gender-based violence. But challenge yourself. Have we gone far enough? We still live in a world where women hold 19% of the parliamentary seats, and where only about 24% of people in mainstream news as broadcast in print are women. Just last year, in 2011, it was reported that in our world, women performed 66% of the world's work, produced 50% of the world's food, earned 10% of the world's income, and owned only 1% of the world's property. We know that in areas of armed conflict, of the millions of people impacted, 80% are women and children, having to flee and struggle for their very survival. We also know that many of these women are victims of horrific forms of violence, physical, sexual, and psychological, all as a way to control women and, in essence, to control their communities. Don't you find it ironic that in the last 25 years, only 1 in 40 of the people signing peace agreements have been women? Wouldn't you think it's time to listen to the voices of over half the world's population, the women? And maybe we have a chance at peace. So let's talk about leadership. When women are encouraged to have a proper say in how communities are run, amazing things start to happen. In India, councils that are female-led have 62% more drinking water projects than male-led councils. And women often invest more heavily in areas that impact on health and education. Yet women in leadership roles are viewed as less likely to succeed, are dismissed as emotional, and frequently reduced to statements of their lack of fashion or grace. If by chance the woman is confident and strong in her approach, she becomes labeled as difficult, a man-hater, a bitch, a ball-busting feminazi. These images are fed by shock-filled media that want women to know their place. A quote from our favorite, Rush Limbaugh, not the recent one. Feminism was established to allow unattractive women easier access to the mainstream. Women were doing quite well in this country before feminism came along. Or something closer to home, maybe from Prime Minister Stephen Harper a few years ago, who was caught on camera referring to women as a left-wing fringe group. The impacts of inequality affect us all, women and men. We squander the talents of our youth, the potential of over 50% of our community, and inhibit the growth of our industries by not fully involving and seeking leadership and contributions of women. I look at the not-for-profit sector, of which I'm passionate about, which is known for its grassroots work with some of the most vulnerable people in our society: the poor, the hungry, those with mental health issues, the homeless, the abused, new Canadians, children, the disabled. In Alberta, we have over 23,000 not-for-profits, employing over 105,000 staff. And of those staff, 75% are women. These women hold a wide range of varying education and skills, and generally they're well educated, and they dedicate themselves to serving over 100,000 Albertans each and every year. So when we talk about leadership and women's work, we have continued to take on the plight of the vulnerable in situations where the lack of will to support the vulnerable citizens continues to be challenged. Pay inequity continues to be our reality. Project-based funding and the lack of sustainability for programs continues to threaten our existence and exacerbate the challenges of staffing, retention, and positive outcomes, and the continued re-victimization by the systems that interact with the lives of our vulnerable citizens leaves me at times filled with shame and, yes, even despair. As I get quoted at a number of meetings I go to that men are also abused, and we don't see any men shoppers. Why is it? I know men are abused. I know women can also be the abusers. But let's look at the real situation of what we're dealing with. Let's look at the scores of women worldwide who are terrorizing their homes. As stated by the Worldwide YMCA, at least 1 out of every 3 women around the world has been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused in her lifetime. Violence against women is a global problem, and women and girls are susceptible to abuse and violence at every stage of their life. On just one day in the world, 56,308 women and 39,130 children sought refuge from domestic violence. Of those women, 520 were pregnant. 12,342 women and children were turned away from shelters and were subject to continued risk. One day in Alberta, just one day, our 44 women's emergency shelters will on average help 744 women and 606 children. Of those women helped, 52 will be pregnant. On that same day, 22 will be threatened with a gun. 70 women and 70 children will be turned away because the shelters are full. To give you an even more local picture, from March 1st to today, our YMCA Harbour House turned away 68 women and 128 children because we could not accommodate. So let's look at the recent murders and suicide at Claresholm. our community mourned. But they mourned for ball players. It was only a footnote that this was a case of domestic violence. An act of murder caused by a young man who felt the right to control a woman. You ask me how important women's rights are, I tell you it's a matter of life and death. It isn't about discounting the role of men or the violence that men experience, it's about our collective worth as citizens. Don't tell me you believe in being a humanist without being a feminist first. We need to walk in our sisters' footsteps. Those steps that line the highway of fear in BC, those steps of our women who feel stuck and betrayed, where they are denied the most basic human rights of dignity and life. We hear the stories every day in YMCA. The women living in rural southern Alberta whose husband removed the parts of the car engine so she could not leave. Or our senior woman who, after being beaten and spat on and degraded for 50 years of marriage, only wanted peace before she died. Or the 17-year-old girl who really thought that his jealousy meant he loved her, that giving a blowjob was her obligation, not her pleasure, not as part of a respectful, loving relationship, but as his right. We are promised that our federal government is taking the roles and contributions of women seriously, that we have equality. In fact, Canada has signed on to the UN's newest event, the International Day of the Girl Child, to be held this October. Stats Women Canada states that girls throughout the world face higher rates of violence, poverty, and discrimination, and that in Canada, girls have higher rates of depression, sexual harassment, and dating violence. Yet as delegations have presented to the UN on the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, we are reminded of a recent $10 million promise to combat violence against Aboriginal women in Canada. This represents various pockets of funding, including a National Police Support Centre for Missing Persons, a National Registry for Missing Persons, and a number of other items. It may sound like a substantial investment, but at the same time that this investment was announced, the Native Women's Association of Canada was informed that they would no longer receive funding for Sisters in Spirit, a program founded in 2005 for research, education, and policy initiatives that collected information about missing and murdered Aboriginal women across Canada, which also constructed a reliable and essential database of information. The intent is to silence our sisters who expose grave and systematic violations of human rights against Aboriginal women and girls. But it isn't acceptable to advocate against your government. As women take a few steps forward, we are pushed back, threatened with the loss of our livelihood and gagged. This is worse if you are a woman of color, a woman with a disability, or especially if you are a First Nations woman in Canada. Women, we need to raise our voices and ask uncomfortable questions, first of ourselves on how we contribute to the misinformation on our equality in Canada. We need to conscientiously raise awareness on the state of affairs, create the debate, and know the issues and challenge our elected officials. Let's help them move from complacent acceptance to knowing they need to work for us, the 50+% of the population. Write letters, send postcards, write the editor, send roasts and toasts. Complain about advertising and set an example for girls that contributing to our society is the greatest gift any woman can give. It is through our collective strength that we can produce the greatest impact. Nellie McClung in 1910 stated, "I'm a believer in women and their ability to do things and in their influence and power. Women set the standards for the world, and it is for us, women in Canada, to set the standards high." There's a great body of work to be done and a pride that we must have in being feminists and securing the rights for women at home, in Canada, and around the world.
So while women are the ones primarily affected when race and gender inequalities coincide, the human race as a whole is disadvantaged and is progress retarded by these injustices. Women endure discrimination in education, particularly where tradition decrees that girl children are not worth educating. Their health is jeopardized through poor nutrition, poor productive health care, and ineffective protection from unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases, all a result of their social status. Women positioned at the intersection of race and gender are most glaringly affected by the social structures that sustain discrimination and exploitation, but these injustices affect everyone. In the next few minutes that I've been provided to speak to you on this topic, I would like us to be mindful of 7 major principles in fostering gender equality. The first principle is the principle of equality of women and men. It cannot be disassociated from the greater principle, the oneness of humanity. The advancement of women is an ongoing organic process, aligned with forces of social transformation and the movement towards the recognition of the oneness of humanity. The second one, in order to achieve true equality, personal transformation in both women and men is required, namely that both must relinquish all attachment to guilt and blame, and courageously assume responsibility for their own part in transforming the societies in which they live in. Thirdly, inequality of the sexes is a condition not due to nature, but to lack of education. Education is therefore central to achieving equality between men and women. But my beliefs on the topic goes one step further to say that if lack of resources forces a choice for the parents between educating a boy and a girl, parents should consider giving priority to educating their daughters, the mothers of the future, the first educator of the children. This being said, boys must also play their part and must be raised with an understanding of the equality of women and men and be prepared to work together with women as equal partners in all fields of human endeavor. Failure to educate boys for equality will have devastating consequences not only for girls, but also for the society as a whole. Fourthly, legal and institutional structure must be created to foster gender equality. Maybe they are created, but these reforms need to go much further than the present advances, insofar as such reforms need to alter the fundamental assumptions and preferences which underline our laws and governing institutions. The fifth one, equality does not mean sameness. Equality of status does not mean identity of functions. 6, equality of the sexes must be embraced not only as a requirement of justice, but as a prerequisite for peace and prosperity. And finally, even though religion has been a source of division, and I had an amazing picture for this one, so imagine it if you can. Even though religion has been a source of division and social fragmentation, and religious institutions have tended to establish practices and support attitudes that impede the development of women's potential, religion remains a potentially powerful force for progress because it is a source of vision and values. And I would like to conclude by sharing with you a quote from one of my religious leaders. And he says, "The assumption of superiority by men will continue to be depressing to the ambition of women, as if her attainment to equality was creationally impossible. Women's aspiration towards advancement will be checked by it, and she will gradually become hopeless. On the contrary, we must declare that her capacity is equal, even greater than men's. This will inspire her with hope and ambition, and her capacity for advancement will continually increase." Thank you.
Okay, Indoniko Estekiaki. Most of my work is with young First Nations women and developing their abilities and identity. Because as you know, there are a lot of issues surrounding First Nations people, a lack of identity through self-esteem issues which come from, again, the colonization that we have been through. I believe self-awareness is the key to any positive environment. Community cannot bring forward a positive environment for its members if there's not awareness of the positive and negative things that are going on within that community. Awareness of all social issues that contribute to the overall health of the community must be acknowledged in order for the branching out of all the other areas, as well as recognizing the diversity within a community. I am currently aware that gender bias is still very relevant today within society, and when these gender bias occur, it holds back a society and it stagnates the mentality of and growth of any community. Within my Blackfoot community, and you'll find this across the nation and in a lot of different First Nations communities, we have a lot of social issues that are occurring, some that were previously addressed, the poverty, the abuse that goes on as well. And with that, I as a team, we work together to, it's a healing. And again, for First Nations people, I really feel we're only at the top beginning area of scratching the surface of that healing process. And so when dealing with any of these issues, we create a very, very safe circle for these young women. And we also work with males, some of these young men as well. Part of doing that is telling their stories. In order for them to begin that healing process, it's a lot of telling those stories. We create that safe environment and allow them to tell their stories in whichever way they feel the most comfortable. So it could be through a song, it could be through a dance, it could be through actually a written monologue. And we find that working with that monologue creation, their stories become something that, of course, at the beginning, there's tragedy. And as we go through that process and immerse from there through that healing, we also find that there is a very beautiful creation process that comes out of that, where they are able to express through that storyline comfortably, and of course provide an audience afterwards during the show. And then they are able to demonstrate. I must clarify though that we do not put them out in front of an audience and say, this is their story, this has been our process. Of course not. We do put the show forward, and whatever we decide to name the show at that point. So when they and it becomes a part of a collaboration. So when we perform those shows and family have come to see this show, there's a lot of emotional connection that branches out even towards the families that are very proud of what their daughters or sons have been able to do and accomplish, and how they've been able to tell their stories in a creation format. I have seen a lot of these young females that we have worked with go on to very, very commendable places in their lives, because again, we started working off with that self-esteem and again, their identity. You'd be surprised that a lot of First Nations people live on the reserve, but they have a lot of identity issues. And those issues affect how they are able to come off the reserve and into a diverse society, where sometimes it seems easier to go back home. And sometimes processes may not be completed, or if they do, you'll hear a lot of struggle that has come from that. Yes, I do believe that women's rights and equity is an important and relevant issue in my day-to-day life. Absolutely, women's rights and equity is an important and relevant issue to me today. I encounter different people and different life circumstances, and I'm always aware of how people treat each other and how that affects the way I will be treated as well. There are times when I'm especially aware of how gender affects the way a person will be treated. Coming directly from a First Nations female perspective, gender runs parallel with my identity as a First Nations person. Both gender and race are specifically relevant in my day-to-day working and school life. From the time I was a child to where I am now as a young woman, I have seen some changes of the negativity towards First Nations females such as myself, but I still feel that there's a lot of that sweeping under the carpet situation and scenario going on, where as I go through my own school. In saying this, I must recognize that there are still many obvious symptoms of gender inequality that are prevalent in the First Nations communities. So it's not just happening off reserve, it's happening on reserve. And again, that comes from the fact that on the reserve, there was, and no longer is, one First Nations female counselor, and again, that only happens every so often. So we do have a majority of First Nations men running the patriarchal system on the reserve. It is very, sometimes it is a little bit depressing to think about the fact that a lot of those decisions that affect my future future, my children's future, anyone who has family on the reserve, to see how those changes are going to take place. When you get a lot of women that are not participating in their voting rights, and with that happening, and again, because there's a lot of oppression going on the reserve with a lot of that pillar system, it does create a lot of silencing of the woman's voice.
My name is Lillian. I'm a sociology grad student here, and today I'll be talking about two things. The first is LPERT. It's an organization that I'm involved with, and then I'll talk about a little bit about my own research project. So the question I'm going to address is, how do we create a positive environment for young women? In terms of my work with LPERT, and that just stands for Lethbridge Public Interest Research Group. It's kind of a mouthful. Well, LPERT is a student-funded, student-directed, non-for-profit organization, and we provide resources to undergrads and grad students to engage with social justice and environmental issues. We embrace plurality, participation, and we encourage students to critically evaluate the institutions and systems in which they take part. We assist students in translating their knowledge through research, education, and action to serve public interest. So LPERT basically exists to serve the public interest, first and foremost. And in that regard, I believe it directly impacts and helps to create a positive environment for young women. So a culture that supports young women is in the public interest. This is something that LPERT supports on a daily basis. We offer funding and awareness to students and community members. So LPERT supports young women specifically because we are located in a university, and a lot of the students here are young or younger. And overwhelmingly, I think 60% are women at the university. I want to talk about two ways that LPERT helps to create a positive environment. The first is we support research, events, and actions that increase awareness for issues that affect young women. And the second, we support the young women themselves to actively go out and research and participate in this action. We also provide one-on-one support for young women who want to get involved, want to make a difference. You can come into the office anytime, anyone here, and talk with either Christina or Sheila, and they can set you off in the right direction if you want to get involved. A few examples of the research that we funded. I'm going to bring up Auburn Phillips. Her thesis project, again, was mentioned earlier. I see her poster over there. She went into one high school, to learn about the effects of a women's studies course on young women. Another person we funded, I don't know if she's here today, Lana Pedersen. So she's currently studying the experience of Haitian immigrant women who immigrated to Boston and how they've encountered and experienced structural violence. And one last person I'd like to mention, I don't know if I see her here, Katie Taylor. So she studied HIV widows in Uganda last summer. So we fund and support numerous research projects by young women themselves. And in my opinion, these are done for women by women. And they also serve the public interest. Events that we've supported recently, Jennifer Allen came last fall from Vancouver, and she talked about sex work and the crisis of missing and murdered women in Canada. We help support that, and we also support an annual event, the Sisters in Spirit Vigil, which I think is extremely important. I think you alluded to that, Shane. So these events are all important because they promote and encourage people to speak out and engage in community issues. And these issues often involve women. Of course, we're also involved with other social justice and environmental projects and events. If you want to see a full list, you can go to our website. So LPERT helps to promote parity
literacy empowers those who recognize it as a right and a freedom, a way to inspire a better future for our youth. However, achieving sustainable results in the area of literacy and language development depends on the synergy of literacy engagement at home, school, and the community. Literacy learning transpires when a collective effort is made to ensure a child has the opportunities, support, and resources to fulfill his or her potential. This is especially important for the child living in poverty. One day when I was teaching the adult literacy program, one of my students brought me a letter that was sent home with her child. This student had extremely low literacy skills and was unable to read the letter independently. Her young child tried to explain what the letter was for. It was a consent form for comprehensive care. My student explained how frustrated both she and her child were in their attempt to understand the letter and each other. She noted that she was ashamed to call the school and to speak to her daughter's teacher because she felt embarrassed and didn't want to seem like an unfit parent. Her shame was rooted in experiences which over time had eroded her self-esteem. She recalled professionals making comments such as, "Can't you spell your own name?" and "You're an adult, you should know how to read." This caused her to further isolate herself and left her with feelings of humiliation and discouragement. The hope of making positive changes in the lives of First Nations families regarding literacy begins with a shift in attitude, discrimination, and stigma associated with low literacy, and must instead be approached with sensitivity, compassion, and dignity. According to UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, it is often the poorest, most socially excluded, and least literate individuals, especially women, whose rights are violated by those with more power. Their inability to read and write and calculate keep them from knowing what they are entitled to and how to demand it. It limits their ability to participate politically in society. It denies them a voice. I found my own voice in writing and making art, and I encourage others, both young women and men, to find their voice through literacy. I discovered literacy as a way to identify with one another, opening up a place for empathy, humility, and ultimately freedom that comes from knowing their true self. As stories are shared, taught, and retold, a space is created where connection to each other is nurtured. I wanted to end the quote by Adelaide Sophia Interpilgus, who in 1892 was the first known Canadian educator of family education, and she declared, "Educate a boy and you educate a man, but educate a girl and you educate a family."
I've been the program director at the Human Services Department of Health and Family Services for the last 12 years. And as we've been talking about the various systemic barriers that do affect the life and the choices that women in mainstream society are able to make or not to make, you can imagine how much further exacerbated these kinds of barriers are for women who are coming to our culture from different cultures and who are having to deal with whole settlement and cooperation journey. So what I'd like to talk about today is I'd like to address the gender inequalities as we see them at our agency, as they are manifested by our leaders. We serve up to 700 newcomers a year at the agency, and interestingly, the gender breakdown is almost 50-50, 90-40, 9-50, it's very, very close. Now, 70% of the folks that we serve do come to us from refugee camps or have experienced life as an urban refugee. So they would have even more barriers and challenges in their settlement and integration because they have not had the choice or the power of their own destiny to move from one culture to another. They have been forced out of whatever situation they're in. So many of these people coming to Lethbridge, and as is the case in the rest of Canada, do hail from what we call non-traditional source countries. By that I mean countries other than the Northern European countries that Canada has always favoured as its major source countries for immigrants. Just prior to and after the Second World War, certainly there was a lot of immigration from 55% of these will have come to Canada from the very, very large area of Southeast Asia. So these folks will be termed visible minorities and will suffer further challenge or barrier based on the fact that their features are different, their accents are different, perhaps their clothing is different. It's interesting to note, though, that immigrants generally want to go to the three large centres of Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal to settle because there are already ethnic boundaries set up. There are communities where they will feel that much more accepted and welcomed, where they'll be able to receive service in first language, shop in first language, and buy the comfort food that they need to make themselves feel a little bit more at home. In these larger centres, actually, pretty soon, and today in some areas, the Caucasian is actually the visible minority. So the fabric of our society, particularly in those urban centres, is definitely changing. Many immigrants do get drawn to the urban centres, and this is a global phenomenon, as we see folks moving from the rural to the urban to compete for the resources that are imagined in these larger centres. Many of our clients, because of the source countries that we are welcoming folks from, actually also do come directly from very patriarchal and established systems. Patriarchy favors the male. Let's just face it, not to put too fine a point on it. And this immigration to Canada then can really upset this hierarchy and further family dynamic. In Canada, we hope for ever more equality between male and female, and the expectation here is, I mean, you've been asked for it, therefore you will be as competent in the public sphere as the private sphere, as that which you're traditionally in charge of. This can really be exacerbated further by a refugee trend that produces more women resettling with family as the head of the household. Most refugees are women and kids. Most men in these kinds of situations have disappeared or are fighting the fight for the effort. Most refugees who are resettled, that only happens for 1 to 3% of the world's refugees, and who knows what that number is. We're also looking more at folks who are internally displaced. Refugees, by definition, have managed to get outside the country and have made a refugee claim in a second country of asylum, whereas someone who's internally displaced has moved from their community as a result of persecution on many different levels, but is unable to claim refugee status because they're still within their own country's borders. So being a single mother might not be so different for a refugee woman within a camp situation or within her own community, but our low context cultural model here in 25% of the world, in the first world, does not make much room for or have patience for dealing with males in the extended family unit and waiting for this group to make decisions on the behalf of the group. In a traditional or patriarchal system, those decisions will be made for a woman and her children, if not by her husband, then by her father, her brother, her uncle, her husband's brother, those kinds of things. She will not be making those decisions with herself. Immigration to Canada can also pose some serious issues surrounding family dynamic, and I'd like to also address the intergenerational conflict that we see. So immigrant women, regardless of skill set, are far more likely to take on a job that is not within their skill set, is perhaps a menial job, given their level of high qualification, etc. Women seem to understand, though, that the kids need to be fed and the rent is paid, and they won't attempts to engage within the severe and most often unwritten rules of her peer group, of the adolescent subculture, she will often meet with serious repercussions at the hands of the males, and also sometimes the females, because the females do often, sometimes will have a hand in it. She will meet with serious repercussions at the hands of the male of the family in an attempt to control that female child, to maintain her virginity, her purity, and thus her marriageability. And we have seen the absolutely awful outcome of that kind of practice in the Shafia case that the book has been doing on Ontario. Other issues affecting male immigrants, I can't really get into this because I guess I've probably got 2.5 minutes now, but this I'm going to throw these things out because I want you to think about them. Access to education. That is the single most effective form of birth control in the world is female literacy. Get her informed so that she feels comfortable enough to say no or to voice her opinions and her wants and needs. In the next 10 years, if we don't stop the practice, 100 million more young women will be married off as child brides. This really diminishes and demeans their position and their power over themselves and their lives. I'd also like to throw out to you a practice that continues today. It does not have a religious or a cultural origin. It is practiced across the world by many different religions and cultures, and that is the practice of female genital mutilation, or cutting, as some organizations prefer to use that word, because it's less demonizing as to the cultures. Anyway, that's it for me. I could go on forever, as many of you guys who've heard me talk before know, but thank you very much.
When I was thinking about how women's rights and women's equity is important in my day-to-day life, some of the first things that came to mind is stuff that's been in the news recently. Christine mentioned Rush Limbaugh, and you guys who use birth control are sluts. If we don't use birth control and get pregnant, we're probably morons or something else. There's got to be another epithet for us. And then, of course, the threats from Conservative MPs in Eastern Canada to reopen the abortion debate. The common Planned Parenthood defunding debacle in the US, which is a big deal. And Parkland Institute just released a report just a few days ago saying that the continued gender wage base gap is highest in Alberta. So we still have a wage gap based on gender in Canada, and Alberta is tied for number one. We're number one. Awesome. These are some of the ways in which gender still affects my life on a daily basis, and how gender rights and equity are still important to me. These are my rights. For many of you, these are your rights too. This is my body. These are my decisions that are being bandied about in the public discourse. More than that, though, down on a grassroots level, I do volunteer with Women's Space Resource Center. I'm on the board of directors for Women's Space. Women's Space is a small not-for-profit that's been operating here in Lethbridge for about 20 years now. And at Women's Space, we work for women's political, social, economic equality. We inform, educate, and advocate for women in Southern Alberta. One of our biggest projects right now, and for the past couple of years, has been financial literacy. We've found that a lack of financial literacy is a major obstacle in the lives of many women. A lot of women grow up with a dependency on men for their financial concerns. Even women who work outside the home for pay, they may never actually hold their paycheck. They may never actually file their own taxes, pay for their own insurance, their own rent and mortgage. They may have grown up, they may have spent their whole lives dependent on a man to do those things. And so what happens when that man is no longer in their don't qualify as a registered not-for-profit, you can't access 90% of the funds that are out there. We used to qualify for status of women. Status of women funding got cut, and now there's just not a lot out there anymore. Fortunately for us, the community is very supportive of the work that we do. The community has really banded together, and we're still strong. We're still doing really well. You may have heard of the big coalition that successfully got alderman changed to councillor here in Lethbridge. We're pretty proud of that. At Women's Space, we figure if we're not going to get funding because we're too political, well, we might as well deserve it. So that's one way in which we still see gender being a real active component of people's lives and what Women's Space is doing. With Red Cross, I work with disaster management. And while we say that disaster can strike anyone anywhere, the truth is that it strikes the most vulnerable the hardest. And that the more barriers you have, the more barriers you have to recovering from disaster. So this often means women, families, new Canadians, Aboriginal people, and the more vulnerable you are, the longer it can take to recover from a disaster. It just becomes disaster compounding on top of disaster, and people are victimized over and over again. I just want to talk, I only have a couple minutes left, how feminism is relevant to me. It's important to me to identify as a feminist. A good friend of mine, when I first met her, told me that she wasn't a feminist because she didn't hate men enough. She's cisgender too, but you hear that, and you also hear women say things like, I'm not a feminist because I don't feel oppressed. After all, all of the sales clerks at Old Navy go get paid the same amount. And I'm not a touchy-feely person. I'm a bit of a robot. And what I really want to say is, I don't really care how you feel. Feminism isn't about how you feel. I am very, very happy for you that you have managed to get to this point in your life without feeling that your sex or gender have been an obstacle to you. But we need to look at the bigger picture and try to understand the experiences of people who are different from us. If you've managed not to be barriered by your sex or gender, fantastic. Now let's work together and make sure that everyone has that same opportunity. And that's what feminism is to me. It's not an I feel, it's not a in my experience, it's a political position. And we need to bring that along with it, because the crisis of masculinity and the issues of women's equity are not even two sides of the same coin. It's the exact same issue. The exact same issue. And I think that men want to be in on this as well. Something that's really surprised me during my pregnancy is how much men want to talk to me about it. I thought at first that they were just being polite, or that they just didn't know what else to say to a pregnant woman. But men have told me all sorts of really intimate, emotional things about how they felt seeing their wives going through pain and understanding they can't do anything about it, how they felt holding their precious tiny baby, the emotional difficulties of seeing that child grow up. Men have really opened up and shared they want to talk about pregnancy and childbirth and parenting. And I think that if men are given a supportive environment, I think that a lot of them want to talk about gender. Not all of them, but I think that there are a lot of them who do. And that we need to make space for them, and we need to allow them to talk in the way that they can. We know that there are culturally ingrained issues in men's communication, but we can work with that, right? We have to have a supportive environment that's non-judgmental but challenging, especially when we're talking to young men. When we say things like, most rape is committed by men, many of them hear, most men commit rape, when that's not what we mean at all. So we need to be clear that we understand that there is no cabal of men who are sitting thinking about new ways to oppress women folk. That's not how it works. There is a system of injustice. We all contribute to it. We all benefit from it. We need to model critical analysis in order to show them what critical analysis can be, and to show people, privileged people, that none of us is exempt. At the same time, we can't be apologetic either. Men and women both do suffer from patriarchy, but not in the same ways and not to the same extent. We can discuss this with men without making any individual person guilty by association. So I just want to say as my final comment that what we need to do to make a supportive environment, one of the things is that we can't get tired of having these conversations. For those of us who've been working in women's rights and human rights, it can feel like all of these arguments, all of these points have been said a million, billion times, whatever, we all know it, it's all sort of standard, it's all sort of the line that we all know. But when we think about young people who may be hearing these ideas for the very first time, these ideas are mind-blowing. When I think of the very first gender-themed course I ever took, which was Sociology of Gender, with Claudia Malapita, I remember how my mind was just blown. It was just a whole new world had opened up. I finally understood the dark underbelly. I was insufferable. I couldn't watch a movie for years. If I had had this sort of education as a high schooler, when I was already insufferable, it might have saved everyone a little bit of pain. But these discussions need to still keep happening. And we need to realize that for young people, that this may be the very first time they've ever heard these ideas. And we have to still keep enthusiastic and passionate and angry about these things that some of us may be worn down by from years of being in this. Thank you. Okay, there are 5 points that I've put together based on what our speaker said, but also people's questions and comments. And so the first is the assumption and the myth that we already have me, it just sounds like we need some radical action, and I was thinking we kind of need like a flashback to the